What's up, guys? Today we're going to be talking about The Boogeyman. This is a Stephen King adaptation, well, a short story by Stephen King, so not quite the same level as some of his other stories. But either way, I read this story a while ago, thought it was really creepy. When I heard they were doing an adaptation, I was kind of wondering how they were going to do this. This film is directed by Rob Savage, who is probably best known for making 2020's Host, which was sort of a pandemic project. And it's really interesting because it's made completely through webcam footage, and it actually is pretty solid if you ask me. He makes great use of subtlety and just really cheap gimmicks that, I don't mean cheap as in poorly executed, I mean like low cost, and he was able to make a lot with such a small budget, and I really appreciate that. Then he went on to do Dashcam, which came out last year, I think. Did not care for that at all. I found every single character in that movie to be abysmal, unbearable to watch. Really didn't like that film at all, so I was kind of hoping this would be a return to form for him. This is sort of his first big studio film. So the movie follows Sophie Thatcher's character, Sadie, and her sister Sawyer, played by Vivian Lyra Blair. Their mother just recently died in a very disturbing circumstance, and their father, played by Chris Messina, I think his name was Will, he's a therapist. And so it's all about this family drama sort of thing. This is written by the same people that wrote A Quiet Place, so it sort of feels in that same sort of worldview as that film. Something happens that sort of causes this creature, this demonic presence to be planted inside their home. And I don't want to say what it was because I was told about it before watching the film. I kind of wish I wasn't because it ruined sort of the suspense of the first act of the film. Granted, if you've read the Stephen King short, you're going to know exactly where it's going. But if you haven't, I want you to be able to go into it not knowing what's going to happen. The best way I can describe this movie is if The Babadook and Smile from last year had a baby. Really weird way to describe it, but it kind of fits. I'll say this, The Boogeyman has some really great standout moments and a few really suspenseful sequences that were really memorable and just kind of stuck around in my head and reminded me that Rob Savage is a guy that does have some talent. I think he has a lot to offer the horror genre. With that said, there are also a lot of things that really bugged me in this movie. This is some of the most excessive use of horror tropes that I have seen in a long time. Let's start with the good though. First of all, Sophie Thatcher, she's on Yellow Jackets. If you haven't watched Yellow Jackets, highly recommend. She's great there too. And she's really good here. She carries a lot of emotional weight with dealing with the grief of the loss of her mother. But to give due credit, Vivian Lyra Blair as her sister, a child actor, you know, I'm always concerned going into a film that the child actor is going to ruin it. But she's really good as well, and I'm glad that she wasn't one of those characters who is weirdly infatuated with the evil presence. Again, to give this movie credit, I think one of the few tropes that it doesn't participate in is the whole thing where the child of the household is really interested and not scared of the evil presence inside the home. Here, she's just as scared of it as everybody else, and she's trying to convince them that it's real. Overall, I will say there are some really suspenseful sequences in the film. Overall, I wouldn't say it's a very scary movie. Like, it's not the kind of film that's going to keep you up all night with the lights on because you're so scared that there might be something in your closet, but it is unsettling at times. One thing that Savage does a really good job with is making the viewer constantly scan really dark frames, every inch of this damn thing, looking for the monster because it could be hiding in plain sight, because sometimes it really is. There were times watching this film where I didn't even notice that the monster was present until like the last frame of a shot. There's also one scene in particular where a character is looking at sort of the other side of a room, and the screen is almost completely dark except for these two little white spots on the screen, and he does a really good job of playing with your expectations of whether or not you're looking at the monster's eyes or if it's just some other light that the character is misinterpreting as the monster. Really good stuff. And if you've seen the trailer, you know there's a sequence involving the younger sister seeing something coming out of her closet and eventually under her bed. That entire sequence really well helmed. I wish the rest of the movie was to that standard. I really think that the whole light up ball that she has, that she rolls around throughout the film, is going to become pretty synonymous with this movie. I don't quite think iconic is the right word because I would have to think this movie is going to be really popular to say it's iconic, but I feel like that's an image that's going to stick in a lot of people's heads. One other side note that I want to talk about real quick is the jump scares, because much like Smile, I think this movie has a few more jump scares than it needs, but I'll admit that some of them were actually pretty effective. barring one that takes place in a dream sequence that I think is totally unnecessary and adds nothing to the movie. But I want to reiterate that I'm not one of those people who thinks that jump scares are inherently bad. I think it's perfectly fine to want to go see just a fun summer horror movie that has jump scares in it to make you jolt out of your seat every once in a while, as long as they're effectively built up to. The monster design was pretty cool, pretty unique. I won't say that the way that they brought the monster to life was as fulfilling as it could have been. We'll get into that later though. Before we get to the negatives though, I do want to touch on the fact that this is another one of those horror films that is about grief and about trauma, and I know a lot of people are really sick of that. There have been a lot of horror films over the last couple of years that use grief and use trauma as a means to create suspense and to create an evil entity within their story. And in this case, the Boogeyman is quite literally a manifestation of grief, but also I like the spin that they put in this movie where it's almost more about parents not paying attention to their children and what they may be going through psychologically. And it's more ironic in this film because Chris Messina's character is a psychologist, so he should be aware of what his children are going through, yet he sort of shies away from that, and that's part of his arc in the film. I just thought that was a nice spin on the traditional grief and trauma trope that horror films tend to go for nowadays. But speaking of tropes, I'm about to list off all of the ones that drove me crazy in this movie. Generic high school bullies? Check. Crazy dude who tries to explain to the characters what they're dealing with, but he says it in the most cryptic way imaginable, so there's zero chance they'll believe it? Check. Main character seeking advice from one of the monster's previous victims? Check. People acting like idiots and not using the monster's weakness against it after they've pretty much confirmed to have learned what the monster's weakness is? Check. There's just a lot of things in this that really bothered me, and they happen consistently throughout the entire film, and it bogs down other things that I really liked. Let's talk about CGI for a minute, because it's clear that this isn't a huge budget film, and I really appreciate that Rob Savage chose to not show the monster in its entirety very often. In fact, through the entire runtime, I don't think you really get a full glimpse at the monster and see every little detail. But I will say, in the third act, the CGI that they use to bring it to life becomes very obvious, and I think that does detract from how scary it is. Again, it's not that they showed too much of the monster, it's just when they started to peel back layers and show a little bit more, the CGI became much more noticeable, and that, in consequence, makes it a lot less scary. I also found the pacing to be a bit jarring. There are scenes that take place in one location for a long time, and then all of a sudden characters will jump to another location only for a few minutes, and then they're back to another one, and it kind of jumps around a little too much. Also, when the pacing does kind of pick up and the monster actually starts to pursue these characters, I found a lot of the chase scenes to be way too darkly lit to see what's happening. And there's a difference between having your characters inhabit a dark environment and just not lighting your set well enough, and I think this falls into the latter. I don't know, I really wanted to like this, but for me, I think the negatives just outweigh the positives a little bit, so I'm gonna go with a 2.5 out of 5 on this one. Again, not the worst thing you could watch. There are some really great moments in this, some great ideas. The visuals of just a really dark screen with two beady eyes sort of in the distance is one that I won't soon forget. But I don't think the film is quite as scary as it should have been, and I don't think its themes are as well thought out as they should be because it's such a jarringly paced film. And some of these tropes just made me roll my eyes in the movie theater. Like these bullies that are harassing Sophie Thatcher's character throughout the film. That is the type of stuff you would see in a 2018 Slender Man or Wish Upon with Joey King. And that's just not the kind of thing I want to walk out of this movie thinking about when there are so many elements that do work in its favor. But as always, those are just my thoughts on the film. Be sure to let me know down in the comments, what did you think of The Boogeyman? Is it just another cliched, trope-ridden horror film, or did you like this one and think that Rob Savage really does stand out as a director? Tomorrow I'm going to be trying to pull up my review for Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, so be sure to stay tuned for that, and I will see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching.